And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Looking at tonight's weather, we have this system sliding eastward here into the northern Bering Sea with snow and gusty winds and winter storm and blizzard warnings here moving into the northwest coast, Seward Peninsula, and down to St. Lawrence Island. Otherwise to the east, high pressure slowly slipping into the Yukon there, giving way, allowing some clouds eastward here into the central interior. High wind warning, again, Valdez area, or northeast Prince William Sound, Keystone Canyon, Thompson Pass, gust 75 miles an hour tonight. Quite windy conditions all along the North Gulf Coast into the northern Panhandle. Different story, light winds, dry conditions here, southern Bering Sea down into the Aleutians, and drying out here over the southeast coast. And for tomorrow, dry conditions with a fair amount of clearing here and strong northeast winds, especially over the central and northern Panhandle. Strong north winds here all along the North Gulf Coast into Prince William Sound area. Lighter winds here for Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island into Bristol Bay. And there's again winter storm warnings and blizzard warnings out here as this warm front brings strong winds and snow into the northwest interior. And then for Wednesday, pretty good conditions, light winds, dry conditions, and still a fair amount of clearing here for the southern Bering Sea. Eastward right into the Panhandle, still pretty windy here over the northern areas of the southeast coast with a little bit less wind down to the south. Light snow with that warm front pushes into the central interior. Still pretty windy and snowy back here to the northwest to the Arctic coast there, back down in toward the Bering Strait. But high pressure now just west of Kuskokwim Bay keeps it dry over the eastern Bering Sea all the way into the central Aleutians. Coastal water forecasts for tonight. We've got northeast winds, 25 knots there for Prince of Wales Island. Otherwise, gale warnings for the central coast, northeast winds, 35 to 40 knots, and northeast winds, 25 to 40 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal, we've got north winds at 40 knots with seas at about 8 feet. North at 30 for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, north winds at 20 knots. And for Wednesday, northeast winds, 30 to 35 knots here for all of the coastal areas, but stronger winds, north 40 knots, gust 55 knots there for Lynn Canal. Same thing for Stevens Passage out of the northeast though. And Clarence Strait, northeast winds 30, gusting 45 knots. Prince William Sound, gale warnings for the day Tuesday, northeast winds 40 knots, seas 9 feet. Gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast, north to northeast winds 35 to 45 knots with higher gusts. And for the Barren Islands, north winds 45 knots. Cook Inlet small craft advisories for northeast winds at 25 knots. And then for Wednesday, Cook Inlet winds down to 10 to 20 knots from the north and northeast. Now, big drop off in the winds for Prince William Sound, north at 10 knots, seas subsiding to 2 feet. And North Gulf Coast, variable winds 10 to 25 knots. Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, northwest at 25 to 30 knots. Kodiak Island, north to northwest winds 30 to 45 knots for Tuesday. And for the Alaska Peninsula, north winds 15 to 30 knots, north at 20 knots there for Bristol Bay. And for the day on Wednesday, Kodiak Island, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, north at 10 for Bristol Bay. On the Alaska Peninsula, north to northeast winds at 15 to 20 knots. For the eastern Aleutians, east to north winds tomorrow, 15 to 20 knots, southeast to 25 for Adak and Atka. Western Aleutians here, south to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots. And for Wednesday, for the western Aleutians, southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. About the same for Adak and Atka, southeast to 25 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, east to southeast winds at 10 to 20 knots. Excuse me. And for Norton Sound, for Tuesday, south winds 30 knots, southwest 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island, and the southwest coast, southwesterlies at 20 to 25 knots here. Pribilof Island, southwest at about 20, but gale warnings here for St. Matthew Island for 35 knot winds with seas right around 20 feet. And then for Wednesday, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, small craft advisory, southwest winds 25 knots, seas 5 feet. West to southwest at 15 to 20 for the southwest coast. South winds at 30 knots with seas at about 17 feet for St. Matthew Island. And the Pribilof, southeast 15 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. And then we've got 30 knot southeast winds for the central coast. Gale warnings here for the western Arctic coast. South winds 40 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea, mostly south winds at 35 to 50 knots. And then for the day on Wednesday, the Chukchi Sea, southwest winds at 30 knots, west winds 30 knots for the western and central Arctic coast. And for the east side, about the same, west to southwest winds at 30 knots.